The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
We'd like to welcome you back to another special two-part presentation of the Volpe Report with our very own United States Congressman and friend to this show, Dan Meuser. And as I said on my sign-off last week, we have a couple of big issues. We have a little more on the debt ceiling we're going to talk about, but we have to still cover Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas' appearance before Congress, as well as what's going on with the border. And then, of course, we have several other issues, investigative issues on classified document gate, on a probe of the Hunter Biden issue will be looked at. We have a lot of things to talk about. So at any rate, here we are with part two. Dan, let's go back where we kind of left off. Sure. You did a wonderful explanation of what's at stake in the debt service issue, debt ceiling issue. I think we can all understand that this is going to get worked out. We're not going to default. Right. We'll trust you and your close proximity to Republican leadership and decision makers and majority that this will happen. So any final thoughts on the debt service?
I would just say again, we have to pay the obligations that were created, whether or not they were created by the last Congress, which they were, while they were created by Democrats almost exclusively, and the Biden administration. Nevertheless, the requirement, now that we're in majority, is that we plan better for the future, that we don't overspend and hit debt limits far earlier than planned by having a far more fiscally responsible budget moving into next year. That's our condition. Right. And I think the American people agree with such a requirement.
I don't think there's any doubt. I've seen polls with way over 60%, I'm going to say approaching 70% of Americans favoring doing something to stop our ever escalating tens of trillions in debt. So it needs to stop somewhere.
As I've stated, and you know what, spending is the root of many, many evils. It is the number one cause of inflation. That and the Biden administration's assault on American energy. That's a whole nother story. But it's causing workforce shortages. It is a cause of inflation. There's too many dollars chasing too few goods. Do you know Pennsylvania right now has a $5 billion surplus, which sounds good, right? With the new governor come in and everything else. Nevertheless, that's excessive spending that came from federal dollars, taxpayer dollars.
Federal taxpayer dollars.
And food prices are way up. It's the number one cause of inflation. And yet the Biden administration and far too many Democrats don't understand that we must have this restraint. Do you know our level of service on our debt is now almost $500 billion. $500 billion a year is in mandatory spending, okay, to pay the service on the debt. We're not paying it down. We're just paying the interest and the service on the debt. The inflation is causing interest rates to go up. How wonderful is interest rates going up? It's causing more...
Kill small business. Killing small business.
Killing retirement accounts, down 20%. Anybody who owns stock, which is 55% of America, sees their portfolios enormously weakened, strongly hurting the housing market. Young people are trying to buy homes. It costs...
Can't afford it.
Yeah, 30% more in their mortgage payment. Who's going to pay back this debt, right?
Our kids, our grandkids.
Exactly. Right. And what is it going to be at that point? $45, $50 billion or $1 trillion, when meanwhile we have a GDP, a gross domestic product of, by that time would be $30 trillion, so in excess. So we have more debt than revenue that's being created. That is a very, very unhealthy position to be in for a family, for a business, and for a country.
No doubt about it. The current budget that was proposed by President Biden had an increase in discretionary spending, 12%.
That's ridiculous.
12%.
Do you know, under Trump, everybody says how Trump, he overspent. And he wasn't exactly a fiscal hawk, but our discretionary spending in my first 2 years was 2%.
Right.
2% increases.
12.
Now, 12. Across the board. Everything. Every agency received minimally, and might be exception of one or two, 10% increases. Right. Now they say due to inflation, but isn't that just liberalism on parade? Right. Here they cause the inflation with the excessive spending and the assault on our domestic energy, causing gasoline and food, everything else, because that's related to natural gas. And now they're overspending taxpayer dollars because of the inflation they caused.
Amazing, amazing. Let's now go to change subjects. You were on a special special appointment caucus to deal with the situation at the border. It was made up of D's and R's, correct, Dan?
Correct.
You were on that. So you were at the border. You saw it. You interviewed people. You talked firsthand about it. Well, let's get it to current relevance now, and that's there have been calls for the impeachment of Alejandro Mayorkas. Further, he has been called before Congress, and he did participate. I watched those shows myself. Head scratching. You know, you have the secretary who should have facts and figures that I myself have for this show and couldn't answer Congressman Jim Jordan's questions on purpose about facts and figures that he was citing. Is that true? I don't know. It's in the documents. What kind of answer is that? I'd be asking a court in a trial. I'd be, you order the witness to answer the question. You know, so let's start with where we are with the border crisis.
Secretary Mayorkas is a disgrace. Biden administration having him in that position makes it their fault. What's occurring at the border? The border agents, Customs and Border Patrol, that I've met with several times in Washington and at the border twice, want him to be removed from that position because they think he's doing not just an awful job, but he's not even following the laws that exist and giving them the resources to even come close to doing their job in any level of success, certainly not excellence. It's a complete, utter disaster. We've got over 200,000 a month, 250,000 a month coming across. That doesn't include the gotaways, right? Never do you hear, they almost have a gag order on the detention centers. Joe Biden finally, ever in his life, went down to the border. He went to a detention center that nobody was in.
I heard.
Nobody was in it. When I went to a detention center, it was frankly disgusting. There were, and this was under while Biden was president. There was a room, forget what they exactly called it, but like a tented room that they kept these young people, for instance, supposed to be 40 in there, like 120. And they said, we try to let them come out once a day. I mean, this is crazy. And then during Trump years, if you remember, the media was constantly criticizing this and that and the other thing. And we had towards the end of Trump's presidency, 25,000, which is a lot, but 25,000 versus 250,000 coming across and on the decline. The drugs coming across. Mayorkas sat in a room, a small room with me and 6 other members, just going back a year now, told me to look me in the eye, told me that the border was secure and that the drugs coming across were being curtailed, were being minimized. I went back down to the border afterwards. It was completely untrue. Right. The first thing they want to show you was all the drugs that they confiscated just in the last few days. Right. I mean, kilos of cocaine that they're showing me. The fentanyl, more in a month to kill everybody in the United States. And so this guy, the laws he's not following, Mayorkas, meaning Secretary Mayorkas, is the Remain in Mexico regulation that would require asylum seekers to seek asylum in their first, it's only Remain in Mexico, that's just the name of it. Right. You seek asylum in the first country of entry. That's how it's supposed to be.
Of course.
But they're just letting them flow through. And understand this, they love saying how, oh, people come in and seeking asylum, we're the country of welcoming. We are the country of welcoming. We let almost 2 million people a year into the United States through the proper channels, work visas, etc. Now, there's no question. I think work visas need to be worked on and things of that nature. Of
course.
But you got to have border security first.
Right.
So when they're coming across, they're being coached by the cartels. And this is not opinion. This is fact on what to say. And it's real simple. All they have to do is say, I'm in fear for my life from my government of whatever country they're from, Venezuela, wherever it might be. So they get allowed in for asylum, right? They get an adjudication date with a judge set for usually about 18 months in the future, and then it's catch and release. Right. They're off into our
America.
Right.
Coming in flights to Scranton Wilkes-Barre Airport at 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning.
That's right.
Documented.
And I saw it. I put a bill together asking for transparency. At least tell us when you're doing this. Right. That's all I asked for. I didn't even say to stop. Of course, I think it should stop. And guess who's paying for all this? We don't really talk about that enough. The taxpayers paying for these planes and hotels and phones and medical care. And look, we're caring people. I mean, they're real issues. Kamala Harris, who was put in charge of this, started talking about root causes. They haven't done a thing about any root causes, about any economic initiatives. I've told them I would go. Put me on a trade mission. I'll help.
2.6 million alone tried to enter illegally last year. 2.6 million, and check this out. Of that number, 1.6 are backlogged. And like to your point about the hearing, and then they get released, catch and release. Right. 1.6 million backlogged. It's a catastrophe. And one more, if you need one more sidebar story, you mentioned fentanyl. Everybody knows it's a scourge. It's highly addictive. It's many times more powerful than pure opium and heroin, first of all. Well, guess what? That apparently wasn't good enough, because as cheap as fentanyl was, and that's why they were doing it, they could cut the heroin with fentanyl cheaply. Well, now what they're doing, because so much fentanyl is killing our kids, they need more of it. And to make it even cheaper, guess what they're spiking fentanyl with now? First fentanyl spiked heroin. Now it's something called tranq.
Yeah, right.
TRANQ.
Just killing people.
And you know what tranq is? An animal anesthesia of sorts.
And a lot of this stuff is coming from China, by the way.
Of course.
So that's one of our task forces. Right. That, by the way, the Biden administration has done nothing about. You don't even hear them talk about it. So that is going to be one of our task forces. And yet you have the lamestream media. If you don't.
Again, you're the king of the quip on the show. I'm going to start printing bumper stickers like they did in Forrest Gump when he'd come up with something pretty good. Go ahead.
But, stating how could Republicans now a majority be talking about all these task forces? Because we need some accountability. We need to investigate. Why is Mayorkas engaged in this? Why are they engaged in this? We're gonna press them on it. And there's one of my colleagues, Pat Fallon from Texas, has issued a bill to a petition to get articles of impeachment against Mayorkas. Yeah. And I don't see any reason why I'm not going to support that. The man continues to not follow the laws, the entry to our country's laws, our border security laws of the United States of America.
It's a joke. And now, as part of the collateral damage, and we know in life, if something has gone askew, there's collateral damage. As I indicated, we have animal tranquilizer. That's where the tranq comes from, the tranquilizer.
I didn't know that.
Being cut into fentanyl, which is being cut into heroin. And now I read front page stories warning people that are addicts that you're going to die if you take this stuff.
I said to Mayorkas, I said, why hasn't this administration declared war on the drug cartels? Declared war. He looked at me and he actually wrote it down. I'm like, all right. Maybe he wrote it down. Maybe that'll would have some meaning. That was a year ago.
Yeah, nothing.
Like
you when he refused to answer Congressman Jordan's question. Well, believe it or not, we're halfway through part 2 already, and we've got to come back with a couple more issues, especially Dan will expound on, and I've done views on this, so hopefully some of you remember, but what's going on in the energy crisis we face in this country and how the Democrats are pushing it. We'll be back right after this message. I have done several views on wokeism and the scourge it has become in its attempt to cancel and rewrite history with lies about the moral code of this country and the attempt to portray America and its founders as something evil. The effect has been felt throughout society and culture, but the incubation of wokeism and its assault on American institutions is increasingly finding its way into school curriculums, especially at the college level. I will quote liberally from George Will, perhaps America's most erudite historian. The subject matter today involves Princeton University, and Mr. Will's doctoral degree in history is from Princeton University. The issue in question is the attempted removal of a statue that has adorned the plaza to Firestone Library on campus. Once again, a student mob, which is in the minority of Princeton students, who fashion themselves in the woke mission to subordinate everything to social justice, are attempting to remove a statue of John Witherspoon, the ordained Presbyterian minister who was recruited from Scotland and would become one of Princeton's great presidents. Witherspoon was the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. His erudition and wisdom were such that one of his most famous students, James Madison, one of our country's co-founders and co-author of the Federalist Papers, as well as future President of the United States, Madison actually stayed an extra year in school to study with and learn from Witherspoon. Witherspoon's sin was he had 2 slaves. Witherspoon was an ardent abolitionist and freed his slaves and predicted 50 years before the Civil War that America's moral evolution would eliminate slavery. I will now quote directly from George Will. Quote, "Today's disparagement of Witherspoon is more than just another example of presentism, judging the past through the lens of the present. It illustrates how the woke become a suffocating, controlling minority. Remember, a university's raison d'etre is a civil but robust, unsettling questionings and disagreements. Looking ahead, can Princeton continue honoring distinguished graduate school alumni with the James Madison Medal? And can the woke attempt to get Charles Wilson's Peale portrait of George Washington banished from Nassau Hall succeed? How many Princeton names will survive one-sided listening sessions about the human imperfections that disturb people who cherish their capacity for being disturbed? Campuses are becoming burned-over places, sullen about the scarcity of things to deplore and cancel within their gates. The woke will have the consolation of vanity. Wokeness has many flavors but one purpose: self-flattery, telling its disciples how morally superior they are to almost everyone, ever. And a university becomes a place where orthodoxy is imposed and only a narrow version of history and knowledge is accepted. So, not a university." End quote. Welcome back to our 2-part show. We're finally getting to a conclusion with United States Congressman Dan Meuser. Dan, the answers have been wonderful, and you're not just on the sidelines giving us inside information. You're in the game. You're affecting the outcome of bills and policies, so we appreciate, again, your time. So let's now talk to something you and I, again, talked about in previous shows. I talked about with Eugene Barr when he was president of the Pennsylvania Chamber. We also have a governor, Democratic governor, who's openly saying he's not committing us to Reggie, which is a movement back to the right from Josh Shapiro, and understands the importance of that for Pennsylvania's economy. So all of these issues, wherever you want to start, but let's start with this question. Talk about the assault the Biden administration and Democratic assault on oil and natural gas production in the American economy and the effects that has both geopolitically around the world, the invasion of Ukraine it touches on, energy prices. People can't afford to pay their heating bills this winter. They can't afford their food. They have to heat or eat choices. It's a catastrophe. So take it, all yours.
Well, it really is a tragedy and a crisis completely self-inflicted by the Biden administration from day one. right? Day one, he canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Of
course.
All right?
5,000 jobs.
I think 10,000 jobs. Oil coming in from Canada. Right now, if we would have had the Keystone Pipeline, it would have added 1 million barrels of oil a day. I don't know if I have that number right. It could be a month, but to the United States.
No, it's a day. No, you're right. A day.
But what it is that was the amount that we were importing. That we continue to import. So that would have sustained us. There's a pretty good argument to be made that in itself would have kept gasoline prices a good $1, maybe $1.10 less.
Of course.
Even with all the other assaults that the Biden administration and the Democrats in the House and Senate have imposed on American energy. And that's what people got to understand. These are hindrances on American energy. It's not on OPEC.
Right.
It's not on, well, forget Russia right now, but it's not on Venezuela. It's not on all the other countries. It's on American energy. Why would an American president do that? And
let me interject one real quick point. And while he shut all this down, he then immediately has no choice but to go to Canada, begging them for oil now after he shut down the pipeline. He's gone to OPEC, some of our worst enemies, asking for their oil in an emergency. He's gone to Venezuela, a dictatorship.
Right.
And last but not least, he's using our emergency reserve duplicitously and really wrongly to help us the election November 8th because he wanted to lower gas. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I had to get that off my chest.
Our petroleum reserves are there for a reason. For a national crisis, for national security measures,
war,
natural disasters, war. It's now 30%, 70% lowered, reduced. Okay, it's never supposed to be used to lower the price of gasoline, especially when oil, especially when we have vast amounts available to us domestically, both in the United States and Canada, which we're very friendly with if we had pipelines. Here are a couple of quick stats. When Obama was president, we'll go back to him, hundreds of new pipeline permits, actually over 1,000. You know how many pipeline permits have been issued under Biden? 2. Right. So
even President Obama, former president, understood you can't cripple the energy production, which is one of the major assets of our country.
He shut down Alaska. Okay, forget about ANWR. Everybody up in ANWR wants that to be opened up. We've got tremendous oil reserves there. They shut down the Gulf, right? They're doing everything they possibly can to shut down the Marcellus Shale, Pennsylvania natural gas. Again, American energy. Now, natural gas is half the carbon emissions, half the greenhouse emissions of oil. It is plentiful. It is cheap, and yet they're doing everything they can to not just dissuade, but to stop business investment, banking investment, financial institutions investment in the development of the natural gas industry. And that's one of the main reasons I'm now on financial services, because they're doing it illegally. Illegal actions are being taken that are based upon ideology, not based upon best outcomes for an investment portfolio. And banks, small and large. I've had small banks say to me, "You wouldn't believe the call I got from bank overseers and such."
Federal government.
Right. And threatening them. Coal, same thing. And yet, the other crazy part is, we have such high pollutant restraints and standards in the United States
already
versus OPEC, versus Venezuela. We're all breathing the same air.
Right. The earth keeps spinning.
Why would they do this? And it has crippled our economy in so many ways, caused inflation to go up, that and spending. Okay, but both things that they own. That has been their doing is the reasons that we're dealing with the economic problems that exist.
And Dan, it gets worse. Last year, I did a show with former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, who now is apparently a potential presidential candidate. He has formed officially an exploratory committee. We talked about it on the show. But he was telling horror stories of Pennsylvania shutting down the pipeline in terms of the connection with New York and New Jersey. He talked about New York State, who has as much energy reserve pretty much as we have, and we were the second biggest energy producer in the country, and they have disallowed all fossil fuel and natural gas, Marcellus Shale drilling. He told stories of Russian tankers on United States interstates delivering natural gas and Russian oil to our neighboring state, the state of New York.
Look, we're all for cleaner energy. It's happening in the private sector. Innovation's taking place, efficiencies. Every business I go to, Army bases are getting far more energy efficient and all. It's happening. That's good. We're all for it. But, a transition. The transition is 10, 12, 15, 20 years, not 2 years.
Of course.
They're jamming big government requirements into the economic equation, and it's causing all these disruptions. And what's worse is they're not getting it. No. They're not easing up. They need to check their ideology at the door. We need real plans for real people in real life. And as you just pointed out, we're creating serious national security issues.
Of course. And it's affected, obviously, the geopolitical balance.
Strengthening China, et cetera, right?
Yeah, there's no doubt. And one final point as we run out of time is that I've done reviews on the electric car fiasco. And to me, this is one, Dan, we're taking out billions of tons of the Earth's crust to mine for the materials they need for these electric batteries. Cobalt is a bad one. Children are dying in the Congo, which is the #1 source of cobalt probably in the world. Maybe a couple others are close. But they have children mining it. They don't have our health and safety regulations for workers like we have in America. Children are dying in mines for these cobalt, for these batteries. And 2, or 3 I'm on now really, they don't create energy. They actually just take energy from coal-fired power plants and oil and natural gas production of energy because they store energy, they don't create it. And last but not least, they did a kind of a thing in the Wall Street Journal where they actually did a story of a person, one of their reporters, tried to drive an electric car from Florida to Chicago, Illinois. And it was a nightmare. They couldn't go far. It took forever, like literally weeks to get there because they couldn't get ready electric stations or fill-ups. So it was a disaster.
How about $240 billion in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act? $240 billion of taxpayer money for subsidies for electric vehicles and charging stations. You know how many charging stations have been built so far? Zero. So, and that was last year. But look, we got to be about solutions, right? Because American people got it. That's why the show and the communications and the facts that we talk about are so important that people understand and they can help us move those in Congress and in the Senate and perhaps the Biden administration. There is an election coming up in 24 to change some courses here. Change course.
They don't.
Right.
They've interpreted November 8th, and I've said this, to their, I believe, eternal regret as a mandate to continue what's been going on. Instead, there were other issues at stake there. Well, Dan, we're believing now out of time. Thanks so much. You see why we needed a full hour, and you made it for me. Thank you. We conclude now with United States Congressman Dan Meuser, and what I hope was a very informative 2-part episode to the Volpe Report, and he was able to do it, so we thank him for that. And the amount of energy, I told him off air, I felt like I was back in class taking notes on issues. And he has, again, enlightened us on a lot of important issues. And in this great country, you, the voter, that hopefully are informed in this show and others, and by our elected leaders like Dan, are finding out the story you don't hear about everywhere. You need to know these facts, and you need to vote them. So at any rate, we'll be back again with another guest covering other topics next week. Look forward to seeing you then.